The man who fixed what others ignored. He spent 30 years fixing trucks nobody cared about. When they let him go, the whole town broke down, and they came crawling back. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting a yellow circle over the concrete floor. It was just after midnight, and the Ridgeline freight yard was silent. The kind of silence that only comes when engines cool and people forget. But inside Bay 3, someone was still working. Ed Miles knelt beside the rear axle of a long-haul rig, wiping grease from a socket wrench. He moved slowly, not because he was tired, but because that's how he worked. Deliberate, careful, with a kind of respect for the machine in front of him. The air smelled like diesel and cold metal, the scent of his entire adult life. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not anymore. 2 weeks earlier, Ed had walked out of this place with his toolbox in hand and 30 years on his back. No handshake. No thank you. Just a clipped order from a new boss who thought profit was more important than safety. So Ed did what he'd never done before. He packed up and left. But tonight, they called him. Not a manager, not corporate, a driver. A rig had broken down just outside town. Brake failure. The guy behind the wheel was new, scared, and stranded. Dispatch was useless. And someone remembered Ed, said, "If anyone can fix this without cutting corners, it's him." So Ed came, not out of loyalty to the company. That was gone. He came because there was a truck on the side of the road with a young man inside who didn't deserve to pay the price for someone else's shortcuts. The truck was towed in just after 11. Ed didn't ask questions. He just rolled up his sleeves and got to work, like always. Under the glow of the overhead bulb, he tightened the final bolt and sat back. His knees ached. His back complained. But the job was done. Clean, safe, right. He stood up slowly, brushing the dust off his coveralls. The bay was quiet again. Tools put away, work finished. And for a moment, just a moment, the place felt like it used to. Before the schedules, before the meetings, before they forgot what it meant to care. He picked up his thermos, took one sip of lukewarm coffee, and looked toward the open bay door. The night was still. Somewhere out there, the next chapter was waiting. Ed Miles started working on trucks before he had a driver's license. His first job was sweeping the garage floor at Halbrook Diesel Services in the summer of '93. A skinny 17-year-old with grease on his jeans and a quiet way of watching everything. He didn't go to college, never wanted to. What he wanted was to understand machines, why they failed, how to fix them, how to make them last longer than they were supposed to. So he learned, not from books, but from men with oil-stained hands and patience in their voices. By 20, Ed was doing brake lines and clutch jobs on his own. By 30, he could listen to an engine idle and tell you what was wrong without opening the hood. People noticed, even the ones who didn't say much, especially the drivers. He wasn't loud. He didn't crack jokes or play the radio too high. But when Ed fixed your rig, you knew you were safe. That mattered in a business where one loose bolt could mean the end of a life or a lawsuit. He didn't brag, but the story spread. There was the time he pulled a seized axle on the side of Highway 17 in the middle of a snowstorm, or the time he caught a misaligned brake pad that would have burned out the tire halfway through a canyon run. He didn't keep count, but others did. By the time Ridgeline Freight hired him in 1997, Ed had a reputation: quiet, reliable, precise. He took the night shift because it gave him space to work. Fewer people, less noise. Just him, the trucks, and time. He didn't miss a shift in 18 years. Not for birthdays, not for storms. Not even the night his wife got the biopsy call. She told him to go, said the shop needed him, and she'd be waiting when he got home. And she was, until she wasn't. After Melanie passed, Ed showed up the next night anyway. Eyes swollen, hands steady. He said fixing things was all he knew. Said grief didn't mean you stopped being useful. The younger techs watched him like a lighthouse. Someone who never drifted, never snapped, never threw tools when something jammed. He taught them without talking much. A raised eyebrow, a second look, a quiet, try again. Management liked him because he never complained. Drivers liked him because he never guessed. And the shop ran better when he was there. It was never about the money. Ed made enough. Not flashy, just enough to cover the mortgage, help his daughter through nursing school, and keep fresh oil in his old Ford Ranger. What mattered to him wasn't the paycheck. It was the work, the rightness of it, the responsibility. He kept a photo above his bench. Melanie in a baseball cap, holding a can of root beer, grinning like it was summer forever. Below it was a quote, faded now. Do it right or don't do it at all. And Ed never did anything halfway. That was the man they let go. The first sign came quietly. A new coffee machine showed up in the break room one Monday morning. Sleek, touchscreen, no smell. The old glass pot and its burnt bottom aroma were gone. So was the note Ed had kept taped above it for years. Don't forget to rinse. We all drink from the same pot. Nobody said anything, but people noticed. 2 weeks later, management held a mandatory meeting. That was new. Most of the guys wore shop rags in their back pockets and grease under their nails. Not used to PowerPoint slides. But the young man at the front wore a tailored shirt and smiled like he already had answers to questions no one asked. Corey Sellers, he introduced himself. New operations lead. He was 35 maybe. MBA, fast-talking, eyes that scanned the room like he was already running numbers in his head. He said words like streamline, throughput, and mechanic efficiency metrics. Then came the charts, and then the promises. We're going to modernize, he said. Bring Ridgeline into the next phase of performance. Some nodded. Others stared at their boots. Ed sat in the back, arms crossed. He'd seen a dozen managers come and go. Some tried too hard. Some didn't try at all. Corey? He looked like a man who didn't care what came before him. He just wanted it faster. The changes came fast, like he promised. Timers were installed over every work bay. Bright LED countdowns that tracked how long a job was taking. Corey said it was just for optimization, but it didn't feel that way. Suddenly, a 20-minute oil change was expected in 15. Brake inspections? 10 minutes flat. Parts orders were cut. Corey switched to cheaper overseas suppliers. Same specs, he claimed. Better margins. But Ed noticed the fittings didn't hold as snug, the bushings wore faster, and the torque specs didn't always line up. The shop started looking different. The walls where drivers used to pin thank you notes and Polaroids of their rigs were cleared. In their place, corporate posters, glossy, soulless things with slogans like time is money and efficiency equals growth. The whiteboard where drivers scribbled jokes or birthday reminders was replaced with a digital KPI dashboard, flashing numbers, red if you were too slow, green if you stayed in line. Something else changed too. The people. Drivers who once hung around for a cup of coffee and small talk now signed forms and left. Fast. Mechanics stopped double-checking their work. Not out of laziness, out of pressure. You couldn't afford to fall behind. The timer didn't care if the bolt felt wrong. Ed tried to keep to himself, did his jobs the same way, took the time, listened to engines, used his calibrated torque wrench instead of guessing. But that made him slow. Or as Corey started saying, out of alignment with expectations. Once Ed stayed an extra 30 minutes after shift to finish a suspension check for a truck scheduled to leave at dawn. The next day he found a formal warning in his locker. Unauthorized overtime. He didn't argue. He just folded the paper and threw it in the trash. Corey started hiring new techs, straight out of vocational school. Sharp haircuts, fast hands, no field experience. They were quick, sure, but they skipped steps, missed warning signs, and they didn't ask questions, because asking meant falling behind on the clock. Ed offered to train them, even volunteered to run weekend workshops, free. Corey declined. We're looking for scalable systems, not individual styles. That line stuck with Ed longer than it should have. Not individual styles. Like he was a relic. Like his way, the way that kept trucks safe and people alive, was just another inefficiency to trim. The tipping point was coming. Ed felt it. The timers ticked louder every day. The walls seemed colder, the air sharper, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the shop was his anymore. He still clocked in, still showed up early, still tightened every bolt like it mattered. But part of him knew something was breaking, and no wrench could fix it. It was a Thursday, the kind of day when the heat hangs low and every surface in the shop feels coated in a thin layer of metal dust. The kind of day Ed Miles usually liked. A steady pace, nothing flashy, just rigs coming in, getting fixed, and rolling back out. But this day wasn't steady. Bay 3 was hot and cramped. Ed was working on a freightliner that belonged to Linda Barnes, one of the company's oldest drivers. 58, widowed, hauled food shipments for retirement homes. The kind of woman who never asked for favors but brought donuts every other Friday just the same. Her truck was old like her. Reliable but carrying more weight than it should. Ed had done a quick inspection and found something that didn't sit right. A soft line on the rear brake system. It wasn't leaking yet, but it would. Sooner than anyone would like. He didn't mark it as urgent. He just wrote it the way he always did. Replace rear flex hose. Cracking under stress. Recommend immediate attention. He knew what that meant. Drivers did too. But Corey didn't care for recommendations. 20 minutes into the job, Ed was underneath the frame, wrench in hand, when he heard the click of dress shoes on the concrete. That sound didn't belong in a garage, but he'd learned to recognize it. "Ed!" Corey's voice rang out, sharp and clipped. "What's the holdup?" Ed slid out from under the chassis, wiping his hands on a rag. "Brake line. Needs replacement. Not stock. I'm machining a custom coupling. The parts from inventory don't match spec." Corey frowned, glancing at the repair log on his tablet. "This unit's due on the road by 5. We've got a refrigerated load that can't sit idle. Can't this wait till the next cycle?" Ed looked at him, not angry, just tired. "If it fails on the hill outside Dalton," he said quietly, "there won't be a next cycle." Corey exhaled sharply. "Ed, we've got systems in place. If every tech rediagnoses the trucks their own way, we lose consistency. You've got a hard stop in 15. Pass it to someone else or mark it deferred." Deferred. That word meant, "We'll pretend it's fine." Ed didn't move. "I'm not sending this out with a worn brake line or mic shimmer. Dashran," he said, voice even. "Not on Linda's truck. Not on any truck." There was a moment of stillness, not tension, just that dead silence that happens right before a thing breaks. Corey stared at him, then lowered his voice. "You're a great tech, Ed, but you're not above protocol. We've got standards now, and expectations. If you can't meet them..." Ed cut him off. "I meet real standards, son. The kind you don't measure on a dashboard." It was the first time he'd raised his voice in years. It wasn't loud, but it landed heavy. Corey's jaw tightened. "I need your bay cleared by end of shift." That was it. No meeting, no discussion. Just a clipped sentence that carried 30 years out the door. Ed looked at the freightliner one last time, still up on the lift. Then at his workbench, scarred, dusty, lined with tools worn smooth by habit. On the wall above it, his mechanic certification, dated 1994. Next to it, a photo of him and Melanie at a truck show in Tulsa. She wore the same ball cap that now hung on a peg by the door. He didn't argue, didn't plead. He just nodded once and walked toward the locker room. He packed his tools slowly, carefully, wrenches in order, sockets nested by size, the same way he'd packed them the day Melanie passed, when he still showed up for work the next evening. He placed the photo of them face down on the lid of the toolbox, then closed it gently. On the way out, a few younger techs stood near the break room. They didn't speak, but one of them, Julio, the kid Ed had taught to thread fuel lines without stripping the threads, gave a quiet nod. It wasn't goodbye, it was respect. And that was all Ed needed. Outside, the sun was going down. His Ranger sat in the corner of the lot, same spot as always. He loaded the toolbox into the bed, tightened the straps, and stood for a second with his hand on the tailgate. He'd walked away, not from the job, but from a version of it that no longer knew what it meant to do things right. And as the wind picked up, dry and sharp with dust, Ed didn't feel defeated. He felt clear. The new shop was smaller, 2 bays, low ceilings, and a heater that clicked loudly before it kicked in. but it was clean, honest, the kind of place where people said good morning and meant it. Ed started there the Monday after he left Ridgeline. No fuss, no announcement. Just showed up at Raymond's garage, toolbox in the back of his truck, wearing the same jacket he'd worn for 20 years. Raymond, an old friend from his early days, barely looked up from a carburetor when Ed walked in. "You still measure with feel instead of gauges?" he asked. Ed smiled. "Only when it matters." That was all the interview he needed. The days passed quieter now. He worked mostly alone. Suspension jobs, fleet maintenance, the occasional engine rebuild when time allowed. No timers on the walls, no blinking dashboards telling him to speed up. Just the work, the kind he could lose himself in. At first it felt like a retreat, like he'd stepped off a train that kept moving without him. The shop didn't have the resources he was used to. Fewer lifts, older equipment, no overnight parts delivery. But it didn't bother him. He'd always said the best tools in a garage were patience and a clean rag. Word traveled faster than he expected. The first week, a Ridgeline driver pulled into the lot. Kenny, the tall one with the belt that always squeaked. He didn't say much, just asked if Ed could look at his steering pull. Ed nodded, rolled up his sleeves, and got under the truck. By the end of the week, there were 3 more. Linda came too. Her Freightliner still had the same brake line. Ed didn't ask why they hadn't replaced it. He just fixed it. No charge. "Least I can do," he said. "You were the last straw." She blinked fast and left him a box of peach cobbler 2 days later. By the second week, Raymond had to start turning people away. Not because the shop wasn't capable, but because the line was too long. Mostly Ridgeline trucks. Drivers who'd seen one too many rushed repairs, one too many shrugged shoulders from techs reading off a screen. They didn't want speed. They wanted care. And Ed, he gave them that. No lectures, no drama, just the work done right. He still took his time, still checked torque twice, still tightened bolts by feel, still cleaned the bay after every job. The younger guys that Raymond hired started watching him the way they used to at Ridgeline. Quietly, curiously. One afternoon, a kid named Deshaun asked if Ed could show him how to balance rotors by sound. Ed didn't say much, just handed him a wrench and started the lesson like he'd done 100 times before. At night, the place was peaceful. No pressure to stay late, but Ed often did anyway. Not because he had to, because it felt good to leave the world a little more aligned than when he found it. He hung Melanie's photo in the corner above his new workbench. Not front and center, just enough that he could see it when he paused between jobs. Her smile hadn't faded. On Fridays, he brought in donuts. Same brand he used to get back at Ridgeline. Glazed and plain. Never anything fancy. Deshaun started bringing coffee. Raymond grumbled that they were turning his garage into a diner, but he never stopped them. Sometimes late in the afternoon, Ed would step outside with his thermos and look at the sky over the lot. The sun didn't feel as heavy here. The air moved slower. He could hear birds again. Trucks passed on the main road. Big rigs, box vans, the occasional Ridgeline trailer. He didn't miss it. Not the titles, not the politics, not the numbers on the wall. What he missed was something he carried with him, a sense that the job meant something, that good work still mattered. And here in a quieter shop with no slogans and no clocks, that meaning had started to return. It didn't roar back in. It settled in, like dust on a warm hood. At Ridgeline Freight, the first thing to go wrong wasn't loud. It was a small missed detail, a loose sensor on a reefer unit. The technician marked it operational and moved on. But 12 hours into the trip, the temperature spiked and 6,000 pounds of produce spoiled somewhere outside Des Moines. The client canceled the contract. The next week, a trailer dropped its axle halfway through an interstate run. Faulty install on a leaf spring. New guy. Fast hands, no double check. The driver walked away with a bruised shoulder, but the company had to pull 3 units out of service while they investigated. Corey Sellers didn't panic. Not at first. He called meetings, sent emails, adjusted staffing levels. But the metrics, the ones he'd loved so much, started turning red. Delays, complaints, more rechecks, longer repair times. Techs were asking questions he didn't have answers for. The younger hires weren't the problem. They were trying, but the rhythm was gone. Ed had been the rhythm. He was the steady presence, the final check, the guy they turned to when something didn't feel right, even if the software said otherwise. Without him, the shop had machines, but no soul. Linda's story started spreading. Drivers talked. They always did. At truck stops, on CB radios, in a line at fuel stations. The rumor was simple. Ed's working out of a two-bay shop on Mill Street. No pressure, no cut corners, just clean work. Ridgeline started losing more than trucks. They lost trust. Drivers began requesting their maintenance elsewhere. A few filed formal complaints about rushed inspections, and a handful, quietly, started asking Corey to bring Ed back. He dismissed them at first. Old tech, old ways, he said. But then the numbers caught up. Revenue dipped. A third-party audit flagged inconsistencies. Corporate asked for a review. And then one afternoon, Corey got a call from someone he hadn't heard from in years. Gordon Miles, founder of Ridgeline Freight, semi-retired but still sharp. "You lost your best mechanic, and now you're losing your foundation," Gordon said. "Fix it, or I will." That same week, Corey drove by Raymond's garage. He didn't stop. Just sat there for a minute in his silver SUV, engine idling, watching through the open bay doors. Ed was under a flatbed talking to a younger guy, pointing at something with a wrench. Patient, calm, no urgency in his voice. It didn't look like a man who wanted to come back. It looked like a man who had already found what he needed. Inside the SUV, Corey felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. The next morning, another breakdown, a Ridgeline unit, failed brake pressure system, minor accident, no injuries, but it could have been worse. That was the crack, the moment when all the charts, policies, and dashboards suddenly felt paper thin. He pulled up Ed's old file that night, read through the performance notes, no write-ups, dozens of commendations from drivers, peer reviews, mentorship evaluations, training logs, all of it solid, consistent. The last line of his exit interview, blank. He hadn't left a comment, just signed his name and walked away. Corey sat with that for a long time. Finally, he closed the laptop and made a call. It was a Tuesday morning when the silver SUV pulled into the gravel lot outside Raymond's garage. The sky was overcast, humid, one of those mornings where everything felt heavier than it should. Ed was under a flat-nosed Peterbilt, adjusting the suspension bushings. He'd been at it since 6 a.m. First job of the day, nothing fancy, just a little more wear on the frame than expected. The kind of thing most wouldn't notice. But Ed always noticed. He heard the engine idle before he saw the shoes. Shined leather. Too clean for this kind of lot. The last time he'd seen those shoes, they were walking away from his workbench with a clipboard and a warning slip. Corey Sellers cleared his throat. "Morning." Ed slid out on the creeper, slow and steady, wiping his hands on an old rag. He didn't say anything, just looked at him, calm, unreadable. Corey shifted his weight. His shirt was still crisp, but he looked different, less sure, less packaged. "I owe you a conversation," he said. Ed stood, folding the rag. "Didn't think there was one left to have." Corey nodded, eyes low. "You were right," he said quietly, "about the brakes, about the work, about all of it." He paused, then pulled a folder from the passenger seat of his car. Inside, papers, typed and stapled. A new structure, a new proposal. At the top, Technical Operations Partner Agreement. "We're restructuring," he said. "Gordon's back in an oversight role. I'm staying, but not running things alone. We want you back, Ed, as a full partner. No timers, no quotas, just standards. Yours." Ed didn't move, didn't take the folder. He just leaned back against the hood of the truck and looked at the shop behind him. The worn bay doors, the cracked window above Raymond's desk, the smell of rubber and coffee. He looked at Deshawn inside, laughing at something Raymond said. He looked at the photo of Melanie above his bench. And then finally he looked at Corey. "I'm not angry," Ed said, voice even. "Wasn't then. Not now. But I didn't leave to make a point. I left because I couldn't do the work the way it should be done." "You can now," Corey said. "You'll have final say on every repair policy, every part order. Every hire. He stepped forward, holding out the folder. Truth is, I was wrong. I thought fixing systems was about speed, but I've learned it's about trust. Ed took the folder, opened it, read a few lines. He didn't rush. He never rushed. Then he closed it and looked up. If I come back, I bring people with me, he said. Not resumes. People. Like that kid in there. Corey nodded immediately. Anyone you want. And one more thing, Ed added. That wall in Bay 4, the one you cleared for those posters, it gets the old photos back. A quiet smile flickered in Corey's eyes. Done. They shook hands. No ceremony, no photographers, just grease-stained fingers and an understanding between two men who had both learned something the hard way. That evening, when Ed walked back through the Ridgeline gate, a few drivers were already there, standing quietly near the lot, hands in pockets looking toward the bay doors. One brought back the old thank you board, frame slightly cracked but still intact. Another handed over a box of plain glazed donuts. No words, just a nod. Deshaun came with him, not as a rookie, as a helper, a learner, a line holder. The next morning, Ed opened his old toolbox. The tools were still there, just as he'd left them. But this time, they felt like they belonged again. Not because he came back, but because what he stood for came with him. 1 year later, the sun rose over the Ridgeline freight yard just like it always had. Gold slipping through the loading cranes, shadows stretching long across the asphalt. But something had changed. The guard shack had a fresh coat of paint. The old metal gate had been replaced with a heavier one. Smoother hinges, better alignment. Most wouldn't notice, but Ed Miles would. Just inside the entrance, mounted on the wall near the time clock, was a new brass plaque. It wasn't big, just 12 inches across. But it was the first thing every employee saw when they clocked in, and the last thing they passed on the way out. In honor of Ed Miles, for teaching us that doing it right is always worth the time. Underneath the words was a small engraving of a torque, wrench, and a coffee thermos. Two things Ed never worked without. He didn't ask for it. Didn't even know about it until Raymond brought him over one morning for a quick tour. When he saw the plaque, he said nothing at first. He just stood still, thumb resting on the edge, as if reading it through his fingertips. Then he nodded once, quietly, and turned back toward the shop floor. Inside, Bay 4 had been transformed. The corporate posters were gone. In their place, a collage of photos, mechanics through the years, smiling drivers, handwritten thank you notes, snapshots of trucks with "Fixed by Ed" scribbled on the back in marker. Deshaun was there, now full-time, still learning, still asking questions, but now he was teaching too. Every week he ran a workshop for new hires. Ed's Way, they called it. Not a class, just a way of working that focused on care, patience, and the things you can't measure on a spreadsheet. Corey no longer wore dress shoes to the yard. He kept a pair of steel-toed boots in his office, spent more time walking the bays than reading dashboards. He still made mistakes, but he asked more questions now. And Ed didn't stay late as much these days. He worked, he taught, he mentored. Then around 5, he hung up his jacket, rinsed his thermos, and headed out the side door, the one that led straight to the lot, where his old Ford Ranger still waited, paint faded and faithful. As he drove home one evening, he passed a billboard advertising a new freight company. Big letters, fast slogans, promises of efficiency. He just smiled. Because somewhere along the way, he'd learned something Corey hadn't. Not at first. That trust isn't built with time cards or slogans. It's built with hands, with patience, with showing up even when no one's watching. And now, after everything, he didn't need a corner office or a title or applause. Just a name on the wall, and the quiet knowledge that he'd held the line when it mattered most. Integrity doesn't wear out. It just waits for the right road to drive back in.